He grew up in poverty, surrounded by the wreckage of World War II, in a town so small most people outside Italy have never heard of it. He had no fashion training, no design degree, no wealthy parents to fall back on. He survived a bomb explosion as a child that killed one of his closest friends. After dropping out of medical school and spending years arranging store windows for a department store salary, he started a fashion company at the age of 41 with just $10,000 scraped together from selling his old car. You would think someone with no formal design education, no money, no connections in the industry, and no runway experience could never build one of the most powerful fashion empires on earth, right? Well, Giorgio Armani proved every single doubter wrong. By the time of his death in September 2025, Forbes estimated his net worth at $12.1 billion. He dressed Hollywood royalty for 5 decades straight, designed outfits for more than 200 films, and became the first clothing designer in history to broadcast a haute couture fashion show live on the internet. The Armani name became synonymous with elegance itself. So how did a poor boy from Piacenza, a kid who survived a war, quit medical school, and spent years dressing mannequins, become the undisputed king of Italian fashion? To find out, we have to go back to July 11, 1934. Piacenza is a small city in northern Italy, tucked in the Po Valley between Milan and Bologna. When Giorgio Armani was born there in the summer of 1934, the city had none of the glamour that would later come to be associated with his name. His father, Ugo Armani, was a shipping manager, a modest working-class occupation. His mother, Maria Raimondi, raised Giorgio alongside his older brother Sergio and younger sister Rosanna, in circumstances that, by anyone's standards, were humble. Giorgio later recalled in interviews that his family was poor and life was hard. And then, the war came. Italy under Mussolini aligned itself with the Nazi occupation, and cities across northern Italy became targets. Piacenza was bombed repeatedly. The Armani family, like thousands of their neighbors, would take shelter in damp, crowded cellars, while explosions shook the earth above their heads. In later life, Giorgio told interviewers that sometimes it seemed to him that he never had a childhood or adolescence. He was not exaggerating. The years that should have been filled with school sports and summer holidays were instead defined by fear, rationing, and rubble. Then came the accident that would scar him for life, not just emotionally but physically. While playing in the streets of Piacenza, the young Giorgio came across an unexploded artillery shell. He was curious the way all children are curious, and that curiosity nearly killed him. The shell detonated. Giorgio was severely burned. One of his close friends standing right beside him was killed, just like that. I want you to sit with that for a second. Giorgio Armani was a child who survived a bomb that killed his friend. He was burned. He grew up in a war zone. He was poor. He wore clothes that reflected none of the elegance he would go on to define. Yet something inside that scarred, quiet boy was already observing, already paying attention, already noticing the way things looked, the way things felt, the way a well-made garment could transform the person wearing it. You see, even in post-war poverty, Giorgio Armani was developing an eye. He loved the theatre. He adored cinema. He would study the beautifully dressed men and women of Hollywood's golden age flickering on Italian movie screens, absorbing the way tailoring could project power, the way fabric could convey a feeling. He did not know it yet, but he was already becoming a designer. He just did not know what to call it. His first believer was his sister, Rosanna. She was a fashion model, and it was Rosanna who introduced a young Giorgio to the world of fashion, who first saw that her quiet, observant brother had something unusual, something that could not quite be named, but was absolutely real. She would later be regarded as his muse. For a boy with no roadmap, no connections, and no inherited wealth, having someone who believed in his vision before the vision even fully existed made all the difference. But Giorgio had a plan, a sensible, respectable plan. He was going to become a doctor. After secondary school in Milan, Giorgio Armani enrolled in the Department of Medicine at the University of Milan. On paper, it made complete sense. He had always been fascinated by the human body, its proportions, its anatomy, its structure, and in post-war Italy, becoming a doctor meant security, stability, something his family had never quite had. However, after 2 years of medical school, something shifted. The more time he spent in lecture halls, the clearer it became that medicine was not his calling. The intellectual curiosity was there, but the passion was not. And then, in 1953, the Italian army came calling. Armani was drafted and completed his mandatory military service, spending time as a medic, a role that would actually sharpen his sense of observation, of structure, of how systems work together. When he was discharged, he made a decision that must have seemed strange to everyone around him. He did not go back to medical school. Instead, he took a job at La Rinascente, one of Milan's most prestigious department stores, located right next to the Piazza del Duomo. The job? Window dresser. Big mistake, everyone probably thought. Or so they thought. Because what Armani did at La Rinascente was something extraordinary. He did not just arrange mannequins. He studied. Every single day he was observing how fabric moved, how colors worked together, how proportion could make something mediocre look stunning, or make something beautiful look wrong. He was learning about retail, about what customers responded to, about what actually moved merchandise, and what sat gathering dust. He stayed at La Rinascente for 7 full years, eventually moving from window dressing into the menswear buying department. 7 years of education that no fashion school in the world could have given him, because it was rooted not in theory, but in the lived reality of what people actually wanted to wear. But this was just the beginning of his real education, and the real test was still to come. In 1964, Giorgio Armani took a job that would change everything. Nino Cerruti, the head of the prestigious Italian textile firm Cerruti 1881, was looking for a menswear designer. Someone had mentioned Armani's name. Cerruti offered him a position designing the Hitman menswear line, and Armani accepted. This was his first real taste of the fashion industry at a high level, and he threw himself into it completely. He was not a trained designer. He had never formally studied pattern making or construction, but he had 7 years of observation behind him, and he had something no textbook could teach. He understood what men actually wanted to wear, not what critics thought they should want, not what tradition dictated, what real men living real lives wanted to feel when they put on a jacket in the morning. However, working for someone else always had its limits. Armani began freelancing on the side, sending designs to multiple fashion houses simultaneously: Allegri, Bagutta, Hilton, Sicons, Gibo, Montedoro, Tendres. He was, in effect, running a quiet operation, testing ideas, refining his point of view, building a body of work that was entirely his own. This was an ambitious, even audacious move. He was still employed by Cerruti, still developing his craft, still learning. But he was already beginning to realize that the vision in his head could not be fully expressed within someone else's brand, and that vision was becoming clearer every day. Armani had identified something that virtually nobody else in the industry was talking about. The men's suit, as it existed in the mid-1960s, was essentially a costume. It was built like a small piece of architecture, a rigid shell meant to impose a certain shape onto the wearer, regardless of what their natural body actually looked like. Heavy woven textiles, thick canvas interlinings, shoulder padding designed to project an image of authority that had more to do with 19th century military uniforms than with the realities of modern life. Armani believed this was wrong, not just aesthetically wrong, philosophically wrong. He had spent enough time observing real men in real clothes to understand that discomfort was not elegance, that rigidity was not power, that a man who could breathe freely in his jacket, who could move without his clothing fighting against him, projected something far more compelling than any amount of padding could manufacture. He wanted to make men look powerful by making them feel natural. It was a radical idea, and he was willing to wait as long as it took to prove it. But patience had its limits, and by the early 1970s, Armani's patience with working in someone else's shadow was nearly exhausted. And then, in 1966, on a beach at Forte dei Marmi, a resort town on the Tuscan coast, Giorgio Armani met a 21-year-old architectural draftsman named Sergio Galeotti. Armani later recalled to Corriere della Sera that he crossed paths with Sergio in a car and that he immediately liked his Tuscan smile. Armani was 32. Galeotti was 11 years younger. They were, in almost every measurable way, complete opposites. Armani was reserved, careful, controlled. Galeotti was explosive, courageous, irresponsible, in the best possible way. From the very first meeting, something clicked. Galeotti looked at the clothes Armani had been designing and saw something Armani himself could not fully see. Armani said years later that Galeotti told him he had significant potential. Galeotti gave Armani courage and confidence. Galeotti had seen Armani's clothes and realized that Armani could go further. This was the moment, the quiet beachside conversation that would eventually lead to a $12 billion empire. But that empire was still nearly a decade away. The road between here and there would be much harder than either of them imagined. By the early 1970s, Galeotti had left his own architectural practice entirely, and he was pushing Armani hard toward launching his own label. In 1973, he convinced Armani to open a design office in Milan at 37 Corso Venezia. This was the first step. Armani began presenting his freelance designs, and the international press at the Sala Bianca shows in Florence's Pitti Palace started to take notice. Something was happening. A new voice was emerging in Italian fashion. But launching your own company is a different thing entirely from freelancing. It requires capital. And capital was something Giorgio Armani had almost none of. July 24, 1975. That is the date that changes everything in this story. On that day, Giorgio Armani and Sergio Galeotti officially founded Giorgio Armani S.p.A. in Milan. And to fund it, to scrape together the initial $10,000 they needed, Galeotti sold Armani's old Volkswagen. I mean, let that sink in. One of the most powerful fashion companies in the world began with the proceeds from selling a used car. The structure was simple. Armani handled design. Galeotti handled business, finance, administration, everything else. Armani later revealed the truth behind that arrangement. Naturally, Sergio had no experience in business, and naturally behind Sergio, there was me. But in the eyes of the world, even for him, we pushed the idea that Sergio was the big guy behind it all in business, and I was the creator. It was brilliant positioning. It gave Armani the freedom to focus entirely on design, while Galeotti fearlessly pursued deals and contracts and distribution agreements that the more cautious Armani might never have chased on his own. In October 1975, Armani presented his first collection, men's ready-to-wear for spring and summer 1976. And from that very first collection, something was clear. This wasn't just another Italian fashion house. Armani was doing something nobody had done before. He was removing the architecture of traditional tailoring, the stiff padding, the rigid shoulders, the heavy canvas interlinings, and replacing it with something softer, more fluid, more human. The men's suit, as the world had known it since Savile Row codified it in the 19th century, was a kind of armor, a signal of status achieved through stiffness. Armani looked at that tradition and asked a single dangerous question. What if elegance could be effortless instead? He stripped the jacket back, removed the lining, took out the shoulder padding, let the fabric breathe and drape and move the way a human body actually moves. He used lightweight silks, linens, and Italian cottons instead of the heavy wools that had defined formal menswear for generations. The result was a suit that felt almost like wearing nothing, but looked somehow more powerful than anything that had come before it. However, in 1975, the fashion world wasn't ready to celebrate him for this. Critics were cautious, buyers were skeptical. The initial year recorded just $90,000 in sales. $90,000. For a company that needed to compete with established houses with decades of heritage and global distribution networks, that number was humbling, almost crushing. But Armani was not done, not even close. In 1976, something happened that would change the brand's trajectory in America. Fred Pressman, the owner of Barney's New York, one of the most influential department stores in the United States, discovered Armani's work and offered him and Galeotti $10,000 for exclusive rights to promote the brand in New York. That deal opened the door to Saks Fifth Avenue, Bloomingdale's, and a cascade of American retail relationships that began slowly shifting the numbers. Yet even with American distribution, Giorgio Armani was still largely unknown outside fashion circles. His suits were selling in New York, but his name meant nothing to the vast majority of Americans who walked past the displays every day. He was building something, but he needed a moment, a turning point, the kind of breakthrough that does not come from advertising or critical praise, the kind that comes from a single, unforgettable cultural event. That event arrived in 1979, and it started not with Giorgio Armani, but with John Travolta. You see, a director named Paul Schrader was putting together a film called American Gigolo. The film would star John Travolta as a high-end male escort in Los Angeles, a character defined by style, sophistication, and meticulous personal elegance. Travolta's manager suggested Armani for the costuming because the studio wanted to move completely away from the disco aesthetic of Saturday Night Fever and Grease. Schrader and Travolta flew to Milan. Giorgio Armani agreed to do the film. Travolta appeared in a variety photo spread announcing his participation, completely dressed in Armani. It was enormous exposure for the brand. And then Travolta dropped out. His mother had died, his father was seriously ill, and the production fell apart. Armani's entire wardrobe for a major Hollywood film suddenly had no star to wear it. If this had been the end of the story, Giorgio Armani's American moment might have disappeared entirely. But Schrader had to recast, and fast. He landed on Richard Gere, but here was the problem. Gere was cast just 2 weeks before cameras began rolling, and he was several inches shorter than Travolta. The entire Armani wardrobe, painstakingly constructed for one physique, had to be remade from scratch for a completely different actor in barely 14 days. Filming began on February 13, 1979. What happened next would not just save the film, it would launch Giorgio Armani into a different stratosphere entirely. American Gigolo hit American theaters in February 1980. Richard Gere's character, Julian Kay, became one of the most iconic figures in cinema that decade, not just because of Gere's performance, but because of how he looked. The camera practically worshipped the clothes. In one of the film's most celebrated sequences, Gere's character lays out his wardrobe on his bed, a parade of Armani suits, shirts, and ties arranged with almost religious reverence. Drawers full of precisely folded Armani shirts, logos facing up. It was, as Schrader himself would acknowledge, the clothes becoming a co-star. Armani later wrote about the film, "That film marked a crucial milestone in my work. In the film, the clothes from my collection were a style choice of director Paul Schrader. That style, that way of dressing, would become something of a co-star in the film, opposite Richard Gere." The effect on sales was nothing short of staggering. In 1976, Armani's company had recorded $90,000 in revenue. By 1981, 1 year after American Gigolo, that number had exploded to $135 million. $135 million. From 90,000 to 135 million in 5 years, driven in meaningful part by a single film. Armani immediately opened an exclusive store on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. Hollywood executives began demanding Armani suits. The designer who grew up poor in Piacenza was now dressing the most powerful people in the most powerful industry in the world, and the relationship would only deepen. He went on to design costumes for over 200 films, including The Untouchables in 1987, The Bodyguard in 1992, Goodfellas, Casino, and The Wolf of Wall Street, with Martin Scorsese, and dozens more. In 1982, he became the second designer in history, after Christian Dior, to appear on the cover of Time magazine. That same year, a peculiar thing happened that illustrated just how massive his success had become. Counterfeits of his designs flooded the market in such numbers that Armani cancelled the Milan runway show that year in protest. Think about that. The success was so overwhelming, the demand so insatiable, that bootleggers couldn't keep up with legitimate supply. It was simultaneously flattering and infuriating, and it illustrated something important about what the Armani brand had become. It wasn't just clothing, it was cultural currency. It was a signal to the person wearing it and to everyone who saw them that they had arrived. In 1983, he won the Council of Fashion Designers of America Award for Best International Designer. In 1987, he received the first ever Menswear Design Lifetime Achievement Award. The critical establishment had caught up with what audiences already knew. However, just when it seemed like the story had reached its triumphant middle chapter, just when the business was finally, undeniably succeeding, tragedy arrived. On August 14, 1985, Sergio Galeotti died at his home in Milan. He was 40 years old. Officially at the time, his death was attributed to a heart attack. The truth, which would emerge in the years that followed, was that Galeotti had been diagnosed with AIDS in 1984, during the height of the epidemic's devastation in major cities across Europe and America. He had relocated to Paris for treatment near the Pasteur Institute before returning to Milan. His condition deteriorated rapidly. The medical options available during that era were catastrophically limited. For Giorgio Armani, this was not just the loss of his business partner. It was the loss of the person who had believed in him when he could barely believe in himself. The person who had sold that old Volkswagen. The person who had looked at a quiet, scarred boy from Piacenza and said, "You have significant potential." Armani later told Corriere della Sera that when Sergio died, a part of him died. He said he had to tap into his willpower to deal with all the pain and anguish. He said he had spent a whole year next to Sergio in his hospital bed. And it all happened as their career was taking off, when they were becoming known, setting up their company, and reaching worldwide fame. In a 1996 interview with New York Magazine, Armani said he still wore Galeotti's ring every day. He said Galeotti never saw him cry. Galeotti himself never said anything. In a whole year, he said once, "Giorgio, look how thin I have become. That's all." Armani considered quitting. He has spoken about this openly. The weight of assuming full creative and business control of a growing global company while grieving the most significant relationship of his life was almost unbearable. Suddenly, every decision that Galeotti had handled, every negotiation, every financial agreement, every strategic calculation landed entirely on Armani's desk. He was now the creative director and the chief executive officer and the sole shareholder all at once, in the middle of the worst grief of his life. Armani later wrote that during that dreadful year, he lived as though he were holding his breath, but he did not quit. He went back to work, and he would later describe that choice to pour everything he had into the brand, to make it the monument Galeotti deserved, as the defining decision of his life. In a very real sense, everything Armani built after 1985 was built for Sergio. Every show, every collection, every hotel and boutique and perfume and award. His critic and closest friend would later note that his model was Clint Eastwood, whom Giorgio saw as his alter ego, as he similarly transitioned from acting to directing during his 40s. He became at once a fashion philosopher and a fashion entrepreneur, a rare combination in one person. He famously told Martin Scorsese that he had chosen work as his way of life, and the world of fashion was about to see exactly what that choice meant. The decade following Galeotti's death could have broken a lesser person. Instead, Armani expanded on a scale that stunned the industry. In the late 1980s, he launched Armani Japan. He introduced a line of eyeglasses. He created a new men's and women's casual line for America called AX Armani Exchange, aimed at a younger, broader customer base. He launched Emporio Armani, a more accessible line that maintained his aesthetic codes while democratizing his reach. In 1991, AX Armani Exchange expanded further into everyday wardrobe essentials. But it was on the red carpet where Armani's legacy in the 1990s would truly solidify. Before Armani, the Oscar red carpet was, frankly, a mess. Actresses wore whatever they felt like. Designers rarely got credit. There was no coherent language of Hollywood glamour. No understanding that dressing a star for the world's most watched fashion event was itself a strategic act. Then, in 1992, Jodie Foster, collecting her second Academy Award for The Silence of the Lambs, walked onto that stage wearing a sleekly cut white Armani tuxedo jacket and sparkly trousers. One journalist who covered fashion for Women's Wear Daily later recalled that it was the moment another star was born. Not Foster. She was already a star. Armani. That was the night American audiences truly understood what his name meant. What Armani had done with his women's designs was, in its own way, just as revolutionary as what he had done with men's tailoring. At a time when professional women were fighting for credibility in boardrooms and corner offices across the Western world, Armani gave them a uniform that did not force them to choose between authority and femininity. His women's suits borrowed the structural codes of traditional menswear, the clean lines, the strong shoulders, the deliberate simplicity, but executed them in materials that moved differently, that honored a different kind of body. He described it himself. "I was the first to soften the image of men and harden the image of women. I dressed men in women's fabrics and stole from men what women wanted and needed, the power suit." That statement is worth pausing on. It is not just describing clothing, It is describing a social negotiation. Armani understood that how we dress is how we signal who we are and what we are claiming. And he gave an entire generation of professional women the visual language to claim equality without apology. Michelle Pfeiffer, Annette Bening, Julia Roberts, who famously wore an off-the-rack men's Armani suit to the 1990 Golden Globes, George Clooney, Penelope Cruz. The list of stars who made Armani their armor of choice for Hollywood's most important nights grew longer every year. And Armani famously spent almost nothing on advertising in the traditional sense. He did not need to. Every red carpet was a billboard. Every major film was a showroom. By this point, I think you know what happens next. And yet, the sheer scale of what came next is still remarkable. In 2000, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York mounted a major retrospective of Armani's work. This was not a fashion show. This was a museum exhibition, the kind of institutional recognition that placed him alongside Picasso and Brancusi in the cultural conversation. The Guggenheim show drew enormous crowds and was attended by a galaxy of Armani-clad stars, including Richard Gere, who had never really stopped wearing Armani since 1980. In 2002, he was appointed a Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. In 2006, he designed the outfits for the Italian flag bearers at the opening ceremony of the Turin Winter Olympics. In 2012, he dressed Italy's Olympic team in London. In 2007, the year he turned 73, Armani became the first clothing designer in history to broadcast a haute couture fashion show live on the internet. And through all of it, he remained something almost unique in the modern luxury industry. He was the sole shareholder of his company. He never sold out to LVMH or Kering or any of the great conglomerates that had consumed so many of his rivals. In an industry where independence is almost impossible to maintain at scale, Armani maintained complete control over design, over strategy, over every single piece that bore his name for 50 years. "My greatest weakness is that I am in control of everything," he told the Financial Times in his final interview, published on August 29, 2025, just 6 days before his death. Even at 91, still working, still controlling, still the man who had decided, back in the rubble of Piacenza, that elegance was not inherited, it was made. Giorgio Armani died on September 4, 2025, peacefully at his home in Milan, surrounded by those closest to him. His public wake, held at Armani Teatro in Milan, was attended by approximately 15,000 people. All Armani stores across the world closed for an afternoon of mourning. The city of Milan itself paused. At the time of his death, his company generated approximately 2.3 billion euros in annual revenue. His net worth, according to Forbes, was $12.1 billion. Not bad for a kid who once sold a Volkswagen to get started. But here is what I think is remarkable when you step back and look at this entire story. Giorgio Armani had almost none of the advantages the fashion world traditionally demanded. No formal training, no wealthy family, no connections to Parisian ateliers or London tailors, no design school pedigree. He grew up in poverty, survived a war, was burned by a bomb that killed his friend, dropped out of medical school, and spent 7 years dressing store windows. Every single one of those experiences, you could argue, made him exactly who he needed to be. The war taught him that the things we think of as luxuries, comfort, beauty, ease, are actually necessities. The anatomy studies gave him an understanding of the human body that most designers never develop. The 7 years at La Rinascente gave him something far more valuable than any runway credential. He understood what real people wanted to wear, not what critics praised, not what tradition prescribed. What real people, with real bodies and real lives, actually wanted to put on in the morning and feel good in. He told us what drove him in his own words. "I was the first to soften the image of men and harden the image of women. I dressed men in women's fabrics and stole from men what women wanted and needed, the power suit." That was the revolution. Not just a design revolution, a social one. In an era when women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers, Armani gave them clothing that said, "I belong here." And in an era when masculinity was still bound up in rigid, uncomfortable formality, he gave men permission to be powerful and at ease at the same time. As one writer put it, he taught generations how to move through space without resorting to cladding themselves in armor, proposing that the most modern thing a body can be is unburdened. Today, the Armani name spans clothing, cosmetics, fragrances, watches, eyewear, home furnishings, restaurants, and hotels, including the Armani Hotel Dubai, one of the most luxurious properties in the world. The brand operates stores in 37 countries. The language of his silhouettes, soft tailoring, neutral palettes, effortless structure, is woven into virtually every major men's and women's collection in the world right now. As for the quiet, luxury aesthetic that has dominated fashion in recent years, Armani drew those blueprints in 1975. But Giorgio Armani's legacy isn't ultimately about the number of stores or the billions in revenue. It's about something more personal than that. It's about a child who grew up without comfort and dedicated his life to making other people feel comfortable. It's about a man who lost the person he loved most in the world and chose to turn that grief into the most productive creative period of his career. It's about someone who had every reason to believe that the world of elegance and luxury was closed to people like him, and who walked in anyway, took it apart stitch by stitch, and rebuilt it in his own image. Commitment, respect, and attention for people and reality, he said in his final message. It is there that everything starts. He was right, of course. It started in Piacenza. In a bomb-scarred city, a boy with burns on his skin and nothing in his pocket watched old Hollywood movies and thought, I could do something like that. I could make something beautiful. And so he did. The whole world is still wearing it.